Hello, welcome back sa Intermediate Accounting Part 2. So we are now in Chapter 3, Bonds Payable and Other Concepts. Ako pa rin ang inyong teacher, Romualdo Fernandez Credo. So if you are ready, please grab a paper and a ball pen for you to write down the important concepts. So let's start. So bago nating umpisahan ang ating discussion, alamin muna natin kung ano yung mga learning competencies sa chapter na ito. Number 1. State the initial and subsequent measurement of bonds payable. Number 2. Account for compound financial instrument. Number 3. Explain the accounting for the recognition of liabilities. And number 4. State the requirements for the offsetting of financial assets and financial liabilities. So what is bonds payable? Bonds payable are long-term debt instrument similar to term loans and notes, except that they are usually offered to the public and sold to many investors. So usually, ang bonds ay broken into various subunits. For example, in thousands, in hundreds, in 10,000. Ganon. So, pag naka-acquire ka ng, for example, ng 10 units of bonds, i-multiply mo lang doon sa kung magkano ang unit of measurement niya. For example, 10 times 1,000, yun yung value ng investment mo. Pag ikaw ang bumili ng bonds, ikaw ang investor. At yung binilhan mo ng bonds, siya yung debtor. Yung investor is creditor, and yung binilhan mo, yung seller ng bond is debtor. So, ano ang mangyayari? Kasi yan ay contract na magbibigay ng right doon sa holder ng bonds na maka-receive ng cash doon sa issuer ng bonds. So, for example, bumili ka ng bonds kay San Miguel Corporation, magkakaroon ka ngayon ng right pagdating ng at a future date, kung kailan man yung maturity date noon, na makareceive ng cash, including of course yung pinag-usapang interest. So, babayaran ka nung company na nagbenta ng bonds. Kasi nga, sabi dyan, it is a debt instrument. So, there is a contract na nangyari doon sa issuer ng bonds at saka doon sa holder ng bonds. Yung holder ng bonds, siya ang makaka-receive ng payment. Ang issuer ng bonds, siya yung magiging magbabayad. So itong liability na ito ay parang it is more likened to a stock. Para siyang ini-issue, meron din siyang denomination, katulad ng stock, meron siyang par value na tinatawag natin, yung 100, 5 pesos na nakalagay doon sa face value ng stock certificate. So parang ganun din yung yung bonds. Meron din siyang face amount. Bond indenture. So, ang tawag natin dun sa contractual arrangement between the issuer at saka bondholder ay bond indenture. So, yung bond indenture, it contains restrictive covenant intended to prevent the issuer from taking actions contrary to the interest of bondholder. So, pag ikaw yung bondholder, ikaw yung bumili ng bonds ng corporation, so syempre gusto mong i-protect yung iyong investment sa kanila. So, gusto mo ng assurance na mababayaran kanila. So, magkakaroon ka ng several restrictions. So, titignan natin dun sa next slide kung ano yung mga content ng bond indenture. Okay, so ito yung content ng possible content ng bond indenture. So pwede siyang mag-state ng rights and duties ng issuer at saka ng bondholder. Pwede siyang mag-impose ng restrictions as mentioned dun sa discussion natin kanina sa bond indenture. And letter C, it will state dun sa contract, andun yung interest, yung payment dates, at saka maturity due. So, siguro hindi na natin i-expound yung letter C kasi very specific naman. Of course, pag magkakaroon ng contract, especially kung um, agreement on liability yan, of course, kung is interest bearing, dapat nandun sa contract yung interest rate, yung payment dates kapag may series of payments, di ba? And then ultimately yung pagbayad mo na ng buong liability, yun yung tinatawag nating maturity date. So syempre hindi nawawala yan maski sa ibang liability. So let's discuss A and B na lang. So under sa rights and duties, andyan yung call provision at saka redemption rights. So ano nga ba yung call provision? It is the issuer's right to call the bonds before the scheduled maturity. If interest rates decline, the issuer can call higher interest bonds and replace them with low interest bonds. So nasa issuer daw yung right ng call provision. So pwede silang maglagay dun sa agreement nila, dun sa bond indenture, kung ano ang rule dun sa call provision. Pwede kasing hindi na matapos yung maturity date. Diba? So, pwede nang any moment siguro pwedeng ibayaran na as long as nandun sa agreement na may call provision. Kung wala, syempre, dun sa agreement, hindi nila may impose yung call provision. So, dapat naka-specify dun sa bond indenture na mayroong call provision. So, pag walang call provision, kailangan tapusin yung length o yung term ng liability. Number 2, yung redemption rights. The holder's right to redeem the bonds before the scheduled maturity. This option is usually available if the issuer takes the stated action. For example, when the issuer greatly increased its debt or it's being acquired by another entity. So this time, yung redemption right, mayroong right of redemption, doon naman sa holder ng bonds. So kapag tingin niya ay may risk na doon sa kanyang tumataas na yung risk of non-payment, pwede niyang ipa-redeem yung kanyang hawak na bonds. And then, letter B, restrictions. So, pwedeng mag-impose ng restrictions. Especially yung holder ng bonds, di ba? Kailangan niya ng assurance na mababayaran siya ng company na nag-issue ng bonds. So, itong holder, syempre, gusto niyang mag-impose kasi nga usually pag umuutang, syempre wala ka namang kung ikaw yung mag-i-issue ng bond, syempre ang may command is yung bibili, yung mag-i-invest sa bond, yung bibili ng bonds. So, mayroon siyang power na mag-impose ng restriction. Although pwede ring mag-impose ng restriction siguro, pero seldom, no? Yung 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 issuer, no? So, sino ang may command usually? Siyempre yung nagpapautang, yung holder ng bond, hindi yung issuer. Kasi yung issuer, siya yung may utang. Siya yung mag-i-issue ng bonds. Ang kapalit nun is pera kasi magpa-promise siya na babayaran niya in the future. Okay, so pwede siyang mag-require na mag-set yung company ng sinking fund. Ano yung sinking fund? Mag-accumulate yung company, yung issuer, ng pera, mag-iipon yung company ng pera pambayad sa liability. Di ba? Yun yung definition natin ng sinking fund. It is a fund accumulated para sa payment ng long-term debt. So, kung ikaw yung holder ng bonds, pwede mong i-require yung company na gano'n. Para, syempre, assurance mo na pagdating ng maturity date nung bonds, may pambayad sila. So, pag hindi sila sumunod sa usapan, pwede mong ipa-redeem. Pwede mong ipa-exercise yung iyong redemption right kasi may violation. Number 2, pwede silang mag-set ng desired financial ratios, especially yung ratio ng debt to asset or debt to equity. Kailangan i-maintain nila yung good ratio ng ganon. The moment na hindi na maganda yung ratio, so pwede mo na ulit pwede ka maglagay ng provision na ipapa-redeem na kasi baka magkaroon na ng violation kung pumayag naman yung company or yung issuer ng bonds na mag-maintain and then later hindi niya tinupad. So pwedeng maging cost yon ng pag-execute ng holder ng redemption rights. Number 3, dividends restrictions. Ano ba yung dividends? Ito yung distribution sa owner ng share nila sa income ng company. So, pwede, as holder ng bonds payable, pwede mong i-restrict yon. So, restrict, pwedeng wag mo nang mag-declare ng dividends until such time na mabayaran na yung bonds payable or pwedeng bawasan mo lang. Halimbawa, hanggang sa ganitong amount lang ang pwede nilang i-declare. Pwede naman gano'n. Restriction on dividends. So, pwede mong kialaman yung kanilang distribution sa owners nila. Obligation restriction, ganun din. Halimbawa, kung malaki yung binigay mong bonds, binili mong bonds sa kanila, pwede mong i-restrict yan na mag-incur sila ng bagong utang, obligation. Bakit? Kasi mas lalong dumadami yung liability, syempre mas dumadami mas tumataas yung risk of non-payment. No? So, pwede mong i-restrict. Appointment of independent trustee. So, kung gusto mong maging sigurista, pwede kayong mag-appoint ng independent trustee dun sa bond agreement ninyo. So, mas maganda kasi pag independent para hindi siya naka-cling dun sa company, hindi rin siya naka-cling dun sa holder at saka issuer, no? So, independent siya. So, nasa gitna lang siya. It is for the benefit of both the issuer, yung company na may utang, mag-i-issue ng bonds, at saka yung holder, yung investor ng bonds. Kung mayroong independent trustee, para wala siyang pinoprotektahan, wala siyang kinikilingan, serbisyong totoo lang. Number 6, authorized amount of bonds that, sorry for the typo error, that can be issued. So, ganun din, parang sa obligation restriction, no? So, pwede silang mag-limit kung halimbawa kung mag-i-issue ulit sila ng bonds, pwedeng may limit. And yung letter C, sabi ko nga, it is very common for any obligation. So just like yung other obligations, ang bonds payable ay obligation din. So natural doon sa contract, mayroong interest rate, may payment dates, yan yung mga installment siguro, at saka kaya magkaiba yung payment date saka maturity date. Kasi yung maturity date, it refers to yung last, yung final payment na ng obligation. Payment date siguro yan yung mga installment, required installment payments for interest at saka sa principal. Bond issuance. So paano ba ini-issue ang bond, no? So ito yung tatlong common way to issue bonds. So kung gusto ng company ng pera, uutang sila. Pero kung established yung company, malaki na yung company, maraming interest na magpautang, so hindi na maghahanap ng debtor ang company. Yung debtor na ang lalapit sa kanila. Kaya nga ganun na yung setup, kaya nga mas masyado ng maganda yung reputation ng company. Kaya nga mag-i-issue na lang sila ng bonds. Kasi once na reputable company ka na at nalaman ng mga investor na mag-issue ka ng bonds, for example, Jollibee, San Miguel, Smart, etc. Pag nalaman ng mga investor yan na mag-i-issue sila ng bonds kasi kailangan nila ng pera sa furtherance ng kanilang operation, mag-uunuhan yung mga investor na bibili ng bonds nila. So parang social na liability ito. Hindi ikaw kung kailangan mo ng pera, hindi ikaw magmamakaawa. No? Magmamakaawa na usually ganun ang case sa normal na liability. Makikiusap ka dun sa creditor. Ito hindi na. No? So i-announce mo lang na mag-i-issue ka ng bonds and lalapit na sa iyo yung mga gustong bumili ng iyong bonds, di ba? Gusto ka nilang pautangin. At syempre kikita sila. Lalapit sila kasi nga assured sila kasi malaki ka ng company, may tiwala na sila sa iyo. Assured sila kasi na mababayaran sa iyo yung liability. Okay, balik na tayo dito. Paano i-issue ang bonds? So una, through underwriting. So ano ba yung underwriting? Usually isa yung financial intermediaries, banks, etc. At yung mga quasi-banks na mag-a-act. So instead na parang sa stock din, meron siya din underwriting. Yung instead na yung company ang magbibenta ng stocks niya, yung company, yung financial intermediary, siya nang maghahanap ng bibili ng stock. So parang ganun din itong case ng bonds. So instead na yung company ang makikipag-transact doon sa mga bibili ng bonds niya, magiging magpapautang sa kanya, yung financial intermediaries na. So kukunin ni financial intermediary yung mga bonds, and then si financial intermediary siya nang maghahanap ng gustong mag-invest sa bonds. Pangalawa naman is auction. So ipapabid mo. So i-announce mo na mag-issue ka ng bonds and then magsasubmit sila ng bid, yung mga iba-ibang individuals or companies na interested sa iyong bonds. And then, syempre, usually, highest bidder ang mananalo. Kung sinong gusto, may mataas na quote, sa kanya ibibigay yung bonds. And then, the direct placement. So, yung company, didiretso na siya sa investor. Direct. Hindi na siya dadaan sa financial market. Hindi na siya dadaan sa mga financial kung saan hindi na siya dadaan sa financial market kung saan nandoon yung mga financial intermediaries. Diretso na. So, ang next ay yung mga types of bonds. So, let's just go over, no? So, maraming types of bonds. So, una muna, yung unang classification muna ng types of bond is as to maturity. Kailan ba babayaran? Yung una ay term bonds. Bonds that will mature on a single date. Yeah. So, for example, merong bonds payable na 10 million, payable in 3 years. So, after 3 years, saka mo lang babayaran yung entire amount na yung entire amount, yung entire amount na principal plus yung applicable interest niya, doon mo lang babayaran. So, yun ang tinatawag nating term bonds. Isa lang. So, hindi siya installment. Number 2, serial bonds. Bonds that have series of maturity dates. And these bonds are payable on installment. So, ito yung opposite ng term bonds. So, ito naman mayroong series of payment. Halimbawa, 3 years ang term ng bonds, tapos every year magbabayad ka. So, yan yung tinatawag nating may series of payment, may kaya installment payments, kaya serial bonds. Extendable and retractable bonds. Bonds that have more than one maturity date, permitting investor to choose the maturity date that meet their needs. O yan, ito ay very considerate, no? Extendable. So, hindi lang isa ang kanyang maturity date. Yan, may option ang investor kung kailan investor ang may option dito, o yan, sabi, yung holder ng bonds, no? Siya ang mamimili kung kailan niya gustong kunin yung bayad. Ayan. Please take note, extendable bonds or retractable bonds. Ayan. So, ang may power to choose is yung holder ng bonds, yung investor, hindi yung issuer. Letter A, extendable bonds. Bonds that give the holder the right to extend the initial maturity to a latter date. Yun nga, kaya nga siya extendable. Retractable bonds. Bonds that give the holders the right to shorten the initial maturity to an earlier date. Ayun pala, retractable kapag na-move siya ng mas maaga. Extendable kapag pwedeng i-extend yung payment. Ay, okay. So, yun. Extendable at saka retractable. So, yun ang pagkakaiba ng extendable saka retractable. Extend. Maturity date. Kapag hindi pa kayang bayaran, pwede pa. Merong grace period. Yung retractable naman, kung hindi na niya maantay yung maturity date, pwede niyang hingin yung bayad in advance. So, as long as nasa agreement nung issuer at saka holder, okay naman. So, let's continue ang ating type of bonds. This time, ang classification ay as to recording, point of view, and payment of interest. We have registered bonds. Bonds issued in the name of the holder. Interests are paid directly to the holder. When the holder sells registered bond, the bond certificate must be surrendered and a new certificate is issued. Yan, registered bonds kasi naka-record. Naka-record sa name ng holder. So, siya ang since naka-record sa kanya, siya ang owner ng bonds. And then, pag binenta nung owner ng bonds, yung bonds payable, pwedeng ma-transfer din yung ownership. Papalitan din, i-register din sa name ng kasi i-surrender daw niya yung kanyang bond certificate. And then, yung new certificate will be issued to the new holder or owner ng bonds. Number 5, coupon bonds or bearer bonds. Bonds that can be freely transferred and have a detachable coupon for each interest payment. Ayan, it can be hindi na ito yung siguro yung opposite ng registered bonds, no? It can be freely transferred, no? And then it have a detachable coupon for each interest payment. So kaya siguro siya tinawag na coupon bond kasi doon sa feature niya merong detachable na future. At saka it is freely transferred. Number 6, zero coupon bonds, strip bonds or deep discount bonds. Bonds that do not pay periodic interest, principal and compounded interest are due only to maturity date. So wala siyang periodic payment, even yung interest kasi is babayaran sa maturity date. So lahat-lahat. So unlike yung ibang bonds kasi, although babayaran siya after 5 years, nire-require nila na yung interest bayaran at a periodic payment, no? 1 year, quarterly, semi-annually, etc., etc. Depende sa bond agreement, sa indenture, sa agreement nila. Pero kapag zero coupon bond ang in-issue, wala kang babayaran annually. Kasi babayaran mo lahat, principal plus interest sa end ng maturity date. Sa term, sa final term ng bonds. We also have income bonds. Bonds that pay interest only if the issuer earns profit. Aba, maganda itong bonds na ito, no? So, magbabayad ka lang ng interest dun sa utang mo kapag meron kang profit. Ibig sabihin, pag nalugi ka, wala kang babayaran interest. Ayun. So, very good itong bonds na to. Number 8, participating bonds. Bonds that participate in excess earnings of the issuer as defined in the indenture. Para siyang preference. Nakikiparticipate para siyang preferred shares. Pwedeng makiparticipate dun sa excess earnings ng company kapag naibigay mo na initially yung claim ng preference at saka ng ordinary shares. So, pwede siyang makihati yung bonds, yung holder ng bonds. So pwede siyang makihati doon sa income ng corporation. Income ng corporation. Makikihati siya along with the preference at saka common. So, ang una kasing bibigyan dyan is of course yung preference shareholders. Diba? Ibibigay muna yung claim nila dun sa income ng company, tapos saka ibibigay yung sa common. So, dun sa excess, kapag may naibigay mo na yung first due sa common and may excess pa, so pwedeng may share ang holder ng bank payable. So, basta pag may natira sa income ng corporation for participation, pwedeng mag-share si participating fund. Makikihati siya doon. Paano? So, didiscuss yan pagdating niya sa retained earnings. Doon yung participation. Number 9, indexed bonds. Purchasing power bonds, yun yung other term niya. Bonds that pay interest that is indexed to a measure of general purchasing power. Yun dun sa fluctuation ng peso. Yung interest niya nakadepende sa purchasing power ng ating currency. And number 10, inflation-linked bonds. So, ito naman yung bonds wherein yung interest rate is nakalink sa inflation rate. Yung kanina, yung number 9 is index na sa purchasing power. Nakalink. Dito naman ngayon, sa number 10, it is sa inflation. So, nakalink sa inflation, nakadepende sa inflation rate yung kanyang interest rate. So, ina-adjust siya according sa movement ng inflation rate. Kasi greatly affect. Kasi this is a financial liability. So, paggalaw ng exchange rate sa for another currency, purchasing power ng peso at saka in yung inflation rate, yung prices, yung measurement ng prices natin, syempre may direct effect sa value ng ating sa mga values, sa mga amounts, sa mga pera. So, kaya siguro na may feature itong mga bonds na ito in response dun sa mga yun. Types of bonds pa rin, continuation, this time as to risks and security naman. Ayan, so first we have yung mortgage bonds. Ayan, so simple lang ito, bonds secured by real property. So pag may naka-attach na real property dun sa bonds, may collateral siyang real property, ang tawag doon ay mortgage bonds. Sige, mortgage bonds. Number 12, collateral trust bonds. Bonds secured by the issuer's financial assets or the issuer's own equity instrument, which are deposited and held by the trustee or the bond holder. So, ano ang collateral naman yun? Ano naman ang collateral ng collateral trust bonds? Yan, financial assets. So, na-discuss nyo na yung kung ano yung mga financial assets o kaya naman yung own equity niya na naka-deposit, naka-safekeep, no? So, yun yung security ng bonds payable. Kaya, ang tawag sa kanya ay collateral trust bonds. Number 13, asset-backed security. So, obvious ang security nito ay mga assets or pool of assets. Pool of assets, ibig sabihin yung group of assets. No? For example, yung mga vehicles, yung machineries, Another is yung subordinated bond or subordinated debenture bonds. Bonds that have a higher yield than secured bonds but with a lower priority during liquidation. It has a lower priority during liquidation kasi nga wala siyang collateral. Wala siyang nakasecure. Pero ang advantage naman nito, it has a higher yield. Ibig sabihin, mas mataas yung mga rates nito usually. Another is yung debenture bonds. So, unlike yung kanina, yung subordinated bonds, so, hindi siya priority pagdating ng liquidation. Kanina, sabi natin, di ba? Kaya nga lang, mas higher yield siya. So, mas mataas usually yung kanyang interest. So, yun siguro yung advantage ng pag-i-issue ng subordinated bonds. Kahit na wala siyang security kasi least priority siya. Yung mga least priority kasi sa settlement, sa liquidation, it is usually yung mga unsecured. Debenture bonds, long-term bonds that secured by specific property. O may naka-assign sa kanya, may security pa rin. May naka-assign sa kanya na specific property. Halimbawa, yung inventories, yung car, yung company car. Number 16, junk bonds. May junk bonds din. Bonds that are very high risk, high yield securities issued to finance leverage buyout and merger. They are issued by troubled company. Ayun, kaya pala sila tinawag na junk bonds. Kasi may problema na yung company nag-issue. Kaya nga junk, basura na. Basura itong bonds na ito. May unstable na yung company. May problema na. May liquidity problem na yung company. Pero nag-struggle na siya. Kaya para makasurvive, nag-i-issue siya ng bonds. Kaso ang tawag pala dun sa bonds na i-issue niya, junk bonds. So ano bang gagawin niya? Usually, ipapromise na niya ang heaven and earth. So, ipapromise niya, mataas yung interest. Diba? Para mayroong bumili ng kanyang bonds. Okay, so as to right of redemption tayo, 17 and 18, we have yung callable bond. Na-discuss na natin yata kanina yung callable bonds and yung convertible bonds. Yung callable bonds that contain call provisions, giving the issuer thereof the right to redeem the bonds prior to their maturity date. So, si holder, mayroon siyang power na pabayaran na dun sa issuer, dun sa company na nagbigay ng bonds, yung kanyang bonds payable. Pwede na niyang singilin in advance. Meron siyang power. So, kapag gusto mo ng ganyan, dapat ilagay mo sa feature ng bonds na callable bonds. Para hindi mo lang siya pwedeng singilin at maturity date. Pwedeng mas maaga, callable. Convertible bonds that the holder can exchange for issuer's share of stock. Kaya nga tinawag na convertible bonds siya. So, pwedeng ipalit ng shares of stock. Pwedeng preferred or preference shares. Pwedeng common or ordinary shares mo ipalit. Let's continue our discussion sa types of bonds. This time, yung classification is as to issuer. Medyo madali lang to. Bonds issued by private company is called corporate bonds. So, for example, ang nag-issue ay ABS-CBN, San Miguel, Smart, SM, Corporation. So, yun ay tinatawag nating corporate bonds. Pero kapag ang nag-issue ng bonds ay ang Department of Finance, ang na-under sa ating Philippine government, so syempre yan ay tinatawag nating government bonds. As to currency, so we have tatlo. We have international or international bonds. Ang international bonds ay any bonds issued by foreign entity in a domestic market. So, ang international bonds ay pwedeng Euro bonds, foreign bonds, and global bonds. So, unahin muna natin yung foreign bonds. Bonds denominated in the currency of the domestic market in which they are offered. So, for example, an American company na nag-offer ng bonds sa Japan, syempre, kapag ang denomination nun ay yen, si yen ang pera sa Japan, so it is foreign bonds. Basta ang gagamitin niya ay kung ano yung currency nung domestic na kung saan niya i-offer ay yung domestic currency kung saan niya i-offer yung bonds. So, yun ang tawag natin doon, foreign bonds. Euro bonds naman, on the other hand, if yung currency is if yung bonds is denominated, if yung bonds is denominated in currencies other than the currency of the market in which the bond is offered. So, for example, yung kanina, sabi natin kanina, yung US company nag-offer sa Japan ng bonds, denominated na siya in yen. So, ang tawag natin doon ay foreign bonds. Kasi, ang inadapt niyang unit of measure is yung domestic currency. So, sa Euro bonds naman, yung i-offer niyang bonds is denominated in currency other than yung domestic currency kung saan siya i-offer. So, for example, yun pa rin, US company mag-offer sa Japan, pwede niyang i-offer yun in peso, so in peso or may peso pa rin sa di ba, sa Europe, sa Mexico. Ano pa ba yung mga currency? Basta currency other than yung currency ng Japan kung saan niya i-offer, ang tawag doon ay euro bond. Example of foreign bonds. We have yung samurai bonds. Yen-denominated bonds issued in Japan by a foreign entity. Kangaroo bonds or Matilda bonds, Australian dollar-denominated bonds issued in Australia by a foreign entity. Maple bonds, Canadian dollar-denominated bonds issued in Canada by a foreign entity. Matador bonds, euro-denominated bond, Spain's currency is euro, issued in Spain by a foreign entity. Bulldog bonds, British pound-denominated bonds issued in a British market by a foreign entity. Yankee bonds, US dollar-denominated bond issued in the US market by a foreign entity. So, yan yung mga example ng foreign currency bonds. Accounting for bonds. So, bonds are accounted for in much the same way as the notes and loans payable. So, pakibalikan yung previous topic natin sa notes payable. So, similar ang accounting ng bonds payable dun sa notes saka notes payable. However, bonds normally are long-term, bear interest, issued at a premium or discount, and entail transaction cost. So, yun lang yung difference niya minsan. Mayroon siyang transaction cost. Yung cost of issuing bonds kasi meron yun. And then, normally, merong discount and premium. Mayroon din naman minsan sa ibang liability yan. Pero it is more common sa bonds yung discount at saka common. Bakit ba hindi na lang siya i-issue sa kanyang face value? So, for example, ang bond payable is 1 million. Bakit mo siya i-issue at a discount, for example, na 900,000? Bakit hindi 1 million? Bakit ka magbibigay ng discount na 100,000? I-issue mo siya ng 100. O kaya naman, at a premium, bakit mo siya i-issue? Bakit hindi mo siya i-issue at 1 million? Bakit i-issue mo siya at 1.2 million, for example? So, mas mataas sa face value niya. Ibig sabihin, in-issue siya at a premium. So, makikita natin yung accounting niyan, of course, pag nasa problem na tayo. So, kung paano i-records yung so magkakaiba lang. Siyempre, yung notes kasi, meron din siyang interest. So, nag-compute na tayo ng interest last time. So, and then, so, i-apply na lang natin ito sa mga problems na susunod nating discussion. Kung paano i-record yung discount, yung premium, yung discount, yung amortization. Siyempre, pag may discount at saka premium, may amortization of interest dyan. And then, yung transaction cost ng funds. So, mas maganda kasi nakikita. So, para illustrate sa next slide na lang. Kung paano yung accounting for funds payable. Okay, so ito yung brief comparison ng discount at saka premium. So, tingnan natin kung kailan discount at saka premium. So, dun muna tayo sa discount. Cash proceeds carrying amount is less than the face value. Katulad ng sinabi ko nga kanina, ang face value ng bond is 1 million. So, bakit ang proceeds is only 900,000? So, mas mababa. So, ibig sabihin, meron siyang discount. So, ano ang effect nito? Effective interest rate is greater than the normal interest rate. So, yung effective interest, mas mataas daw. So, pwede mo yung gawin clue. Then, under discount, interest expense is greater than interest paid. Kasi nga, yung discount, actually, i-amortize mo din lang yan sa interest expense. So, yung discount, parang ang mangyayari, idadagdag natin sa mga interest expense. So, pero I'm sure, mas makikita nyo yung effect pag nag-entry na tayo. So, ulitin natin, discount. Yung cash na makukuha mo doon sa i-issue mong bond ay mas mababa kumpara sa kanyang face value. So, ang mangyayari, magiging mas mataas yung kanyang effective interest rate. So, yung stated interest rate niya, kulang. Kaya ang effective interest mas mataas dahil nga dun sa discount na binigay. Kasi, sabi ko nga kanina, actually, yung discount ay magiging expense din. Idadagdag mo sa interest expense. So, expense mo yun as issuer of bond. Bakit? Kasi nga ang pinautang mo 1 million, 'di ba? Pero ang nakuha mo lang is 900,000. So anong gagawin doon sa difference na 100, 'di ba? Siyempre, expense mo 'yun. So idadagdag mo sa interest expense. Kaya ang babayaran mong interest is smaller. Mas mataas yung interest expense kasi nga yung discount na nakuha ng holder, idadagdag mo pa yun sa interest. Next, sa premium naman tayo. Cash proceeds, na yung carrying amount is more than the face value. So, yung example ko naman kanina, sa premium, ang face value lang ay 1 million, katulad din ng case sa discount. Pero bakit ang proceeds niya ay 1.2 million? So, ganon. So, this time, ang effective interest is less. Diba? Kasi naka-discount. May premium pala, sorry. And then, interest expense is less than the interest paid. So, baliktad. Interest expense is less than the interest paid. Kasi ganun din lang ang gagawin dun sa premium kasi. Yung premium, i-amortize din yon. So, babawasan niya yung interest expense. Kaya, it is less than. Accounting for transaction costs. Financial liabilities are initially measured at fair value less yung transaction costs. So accordingly, transaction costs on issuing bonds are deducted when determining the carrying amount. Subsequently, the transaction costs are amortized using the effective interest method. Transaction costs may require an adjustment to the effective interest rate. So, since ang rule sa financial liability ay mini-measure siya initially, yun sa first time measurement, mini-measure siya at fair value, tapos ibabawas yung transaction cost. So, i-deduct yung bond issue cost sa pag-determine ng carrying amount ng bond. And then subsequently, yung transaction cost will be amortized using yung effective interest method. So, lahat ng concept na ito, katulad ng sinabi ko kanina, i-apply natin pagdating sa problem na. So, di-discuss na lang muna natin for now para malaman nyo yung mga concept. Magkaroon kayo ng idea kung ano ang gagawin pagdating natin sa problem, which will follow very soon, immediately kagad. Bibilisan na natin. Issuance of bonds in between interest dates. When bonds are issued in between interest dates, any accrued interest prior to the issuance is sold to the investor together with the bonds daw. So may specific dates of interest kasi, no? Tapos binenta yung bonds, so parang isasama na nabenta yung interest. Any accrued interest charged to an investor should not be included in the carrying amount of the bonds, but rather credited to interest expense or interest payable. However, kapag chinarge sa bondholder, na investor, yung interest, so hindi na dapat siya isasama kasi sinolder ng other party. So, hindi na dapat siya isasama sa carrying amount ng bonds. But rather, it should be credited to interest expense or interest payable. Moreover, the net interest expense is recognized during the period should represent only the post-issuance interest expense. So, for computation of issue price of bond, I'm sure may idea na kayo dito kasi ganito yung previous topic natin. Sabi nga kanina, yung accounting for bond is similar dun sa notes payable, no? So, the issuer may want to estimate the issue price of a bond under the specified current market rate. The estimated issue price is simply computed as yung present value of future cash flows of bond discounted at the specified effective interest rate. Yan. Okay, so nag-compute na tayo ng issue price ng liability last time. So more or less ganun din yung procedure, no? So magagamit nyo pa rin so paki-review na yung previous chapter sa computation ng issue price. So gagamit din tayo ng present value, future value, present value of 1, etc. etc. So paki-prepare yung mga table. Kung gusto nyo naman, gumamit kayo ng formula na nilagay natin last time. Treasury bonds. So treasury bonds are an entity's own bonds which were originally issued but subsequently reacquired but not retired. Or canceled pala, but not canceled. Treasury bonds are present in the financial statement as a deduction from bonds payable issued to arrive at the carrying amount of funds payable. So, wala siyang pinag-iba. Parang yung concept ay parehas sa treasury stock. Yung treasury stock na in-issue tapos ni-reacquire, ang tawag ay treasury stock kasi hindi pa naman siya ni-retire. At, active pa rin siya kasi hindi siya na-retire. Pero nasaan na yung treasury stock? Nasa possession na siya ng company. Wala na dun sa shareholder. So parang ganun din dito ang concept ng treasury bonds. Itong bonds na ito ay in-issue na pero ni-reacquire ng company, so ni-redeem na siya. However, hindi pa siya nire-retire, hindi pa siya dinidebit to bonds payable para mawala na yung liability. So, ang tawag sa kanya ay treasury bonds. Bond refund. Bond refunding refers to the issuance of new bonds, normally with lower interest rate, the proceeds from which is used to retire existing outstanding bonds. So parang babayaran, isi-settle na yung old bonds dahil mag-i-issue sila ng another bonds which is normally mas mababa yung interest. So para makatipid sila sa interest, kaya nila ginagawa yung bond refunding to save on cost interest, yung cost of money, yung interest. Bond refunding is treated as an extinguishment of outstanding bonds. Kasi nga mawawala na yung existing bonds. Kaya nga lang ang pagkukuhanan ng pambayad ng may extinguish na bond is also another bond. Mas mababa nga lang yung interest. So very beneficial sa company yun kasi nga mas mababa yung kanilang interest. So as long as nasa bond indenture nila na pwedeng i-settle na, no? So or else hindi pwedeng magkaroon ng bond refunding kung wala sa agreement nila. Retirement of bonds prior to maturity. Retirement of bonds whether prior to maturity or at maturity and whether through refunding or non-refunding is treated as extinguishment of liability. So, ang treatment pa rin sa retirement of bonds is extinguishment of liability regardless kung it is refunding lang siya o hindi. The carrying amount of the bonds is updated for any discount or premium amortization. So, ibig sabihin, you have to, for dun sa remaining period, you have to recognize yung amortization niya. Yung, for example, kung ma-extinguish siya, retire siya ng October, so up to October dapat mag-recognize ka for the remaining months ng kanyang amortization. And any difference between the updated carrying amount and the reacquisition is recognized in the profit or loss sa income statement as gain or loss from extinguishment. So yung difference depende kung nakatipid si issuer, si company. So magkakaroon siya ng gain. And kung hindi naman, if it is otherwise, then it is loss from extinguishment. Na again, it will be recognized sa profit or loss. Ibig sabihin sa income statement. So, all will be illustrated. Ulit, sabi ko nga, sa ating mga problems na susunod after nito. Compound financial instrument. A compound financial instrument is a financial instrument that from the issuer's perspective, sa point of view ng issuer ng company, contains both a liability and an equity elements. These elements are classified and accounted separately. Siyempre, iba ang rule sa liability, iba ang sa equity. So, hiwalay ang pag-record sa kanila, yung liability component niya at saka yung equity component. Yan. So, magkakaroon ng reclassification and accounting separately. Hindi sila, hihiwalay mo sila in short. Yung kapag merong ganitong financial instrument. So, ihiwalay mo yung liability component sa equity component. Okay, so ito yung sample or format ng computation to separate yung liability at saka sa equity component ng isang financial instrument. So, yung, for example, kinumbine siya at a lump sum, so magkakaroon siya ng compound amount or price ng instrument. Yun. So, and then, kukunin mo yung fair value of the debt instrument without yung equity. So, kung magkukumpute ka ng fair value ng debt instrument, and then, syempre, pag binawas mo yon, ang matitira is yung equity component na siya, na equity component na ng financial instrument. So, ihihiwalay mo. Kasi na sabi sa rule, dapat hiwalay yung recording and treatment ng liability sa equity. Kapag parehas na meron siya no. Classification. So, ang general rule is an entity shall not reclassify any financial liability. So, hindi daw pwedeng i-reclassify ang financial liability. The recognition of a non-financial liability. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng the recognition? The opposite ng recognition. Ano ba ang recognition? Yung act of recognizing or recording ng asset of liability. Pag ni-record ko siya, ibig sabihin nire-recognize ko siya. So, ibig sabihin, pag the recognition, it is the opposite. So, hindi mo na siya i-record. O tatanggalin mo na siya dun sa record. An entity shall remove a financial liability or a part of a financial liability from its statement of financial position when it is extinguished. O, syempre naman. Extinguish, ano ba ibig sabihin ng extinguish? Nawalan na ng visa. Nawalan na it has lost its validity. Nag-extinguish na. Natapos na yung kanyang prescription period. That's when the obligation specified in the contract is discharged or canceled or expired. So, ito yung causes ng extinguishment of liability. Wherein, kapag nag-extinguish na siya, kailangan mo na siyang i-recognize, tanggalin sa record. So, una, discharge. So, na-discharge na yung liability. So, na-settle na siguro, cancel, kinancel na, or simply, nag-expire na-loss na niya yung kanyang validity. So, kailangan mo na siyang i-recognize, tanggalin sa record. Transfer of non-cash assets or asset swap. When an obligation is settled by transferring non-cash assets to the creditor, the difference between the carrying amount of the liability extinguished and the carrying amount of non-cash assets transferred is recognized in the profit or loss. Yun lang naman ay kung may difference. Pero minsan kasi kapag nagkaroon ng non-cash asset transfer for a liability, normally mahirap i-match talaga yung mahirap hanapan ng property na magmamatch dun sa value ng liability. So, it's either talaga mas mababa or mas mataas. So, ano ang rule? Difference between the carrying amount of the liability extinguished and the carrying amount of non-cash assets should be recognized in profit or loss. So, pwede kang magkaroon ng gain or loss dun sa asset transfer in payment sa liability. So, syempre, kapag depende sa party, no? So, for example, ikaw si issuer ng bonds tapos nagbigay ng property, mas mababa yung value na nakuha mong property, syempre, lugi ka. Pero kung mas mataas yung value na nakuha mong property kumpara sa existing liability na binabayaran niya, di it is gain naman. Profit naman siya. So, case to case, no? So, it's either profit or loss. So, pag profit or loss, kailangan mo i-recognize sa statement of comprehensive income. Pagkatapos ng asset swap, ito naman, transfer of equity security or equity swap naman siya. The difference between the carrying amount of financial liability extinguished and consideration paid. For example, fair value of the equity instrument or fair value of financial liability extinguished, which is more clearly profitable, is recognized in the profit or loss. So, ganun din. Mayroon kakaroon din yung pag-transfer mo ng equity security para sa liability. So, ganun din. Pwede siyang mag-result sa profit or loss. So, i-compare mo yung carrying amount ng financial liability at saka yung consideration. That is yung fair value of the equity security or fair value of financial liability extinguish, whichever is clearly determinable. So, kung ano man doon sa dalawa ang mas clearly determinable, so yun ang pwede mong gamitin para malaman kung may profit or loss. Kasi nag-exchange, di ba? Yung yung equity pinambayad ng liability. So, malamang sa malamang hindi enough o hindi pantay yung value ng liability sa equity na i-issue. No? So, any difference doon is profit or loss. Modification of terms. So, dun sa agreement, dun sa indenture, kapag bonds yun, dun sa agreement, what if magkaroon ng changes? So, dun sa mga agreements, so yun ang tinatawag nating modification of terms. A substantial modification of the terms of an existing financial liability, whether or not attributable to financial difficulty of the debtor, shall be accounted for as an extinguishment of original financial liability and the recognition of new financial liability. So, yun. Yun ay applicable lang naman kapag there is a substantial modification ng terms. So, parang nawala na parang i-extinguish mo yung former liability, mag-create ka ng bagong liability, financial liability. So, kapag substantial, the terms are substantially different in the present value of the cash flows under the new terms. Discounted using the original effective interest rate is at least 10% different from the carrying amount of the original financial liability. Offsetting of financial assets and financial liability. An entity shall offset financial assets and financial liability and the net amount presented in the statement of financial position only when the entity, number one. So, ito yung condition. Currently has legally enforceable right to set off and the recognized amount. So, you can only offset if you have the legal enforceable right to offset and intends to either settle on a net basis or to realize the asset and settle the liability simultaneously. continuously. Kung minsanan mo daw siyang babayaran. Sana yan yung only requirement na inaalaw ang offsetting of financial asset at saka financial liability. So, meaning, kapag hindi niya na-meet yung dalawang condition na yan, hindi pwedeng i-offset ang financial asset sa financial liability. Bakit? Kasi sabi yan, only when the entity, yun. Tapos, yung condition. No? So, pag hindi mo na-meet yung condition, of course, hindi allowed ang offsetting of financial asset and financial liability. So, this is the end of the slide. Thank you very much for listening. So, immediately, para makabawi tayo dun sa bagyo kasi wala akong in-upload na video, immediately, in the next few days, i-upload ko na yung problem, yung application ng concepts na diniscuss natin in problem, yung application niya. So, please be ready kasi baka to test kung nanood talaga kayo, I might upload a few questions regarding sa discussion natin today sa Google Form ulit. So, watch out lang. And then, special announcement. So, after nitong application nito, mag-exam din muna kayo siguro by next Saturday siguro. So, please prepare. No? Anyway, may books naman kayo and kung wala, mayroon naman akong in-upload na reading materials, yung PowerPoint presentation, tapos may discussion. So, balikan nyo na lang yung mga yon. So, maraming salamat. This is still your teacher, Romualdo Fernandez Credo. Until sa next video natin, maraming salamat ulit and God bless.